Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me okay? Am I clear? And I'll try to speak as slowly as possible, given my rather regional accent from Belfast. There were some complaints about that last night, but I blame that on the very good Slovak beer. So anyway, here we are. Here to discuss a very important subject, the lethal nexus between terrorism and crime, and indeed the funding of terrorism, the expansion of the terrorist war chest through criminality. I'm brought onto this subject because I write about it occasionally. Over the last 3 decades, I've worked for various news organizations, from the BBC to The Guardian and The Observer newspapers. And in many ways, what happened in Northern Ireland during the conflict called the Troubles, in many ways, excuse me, sorry, earphones out there. It presaged what was happening in the 20th, 21st century in terms of the nexus between crime and terrorism. So, for example, we in Ireland pioneered the whole use of smuggled fuel to fund the IRA's campaign, for instance, and a whole range of counterfeit and illicit goods that, again, was very much pioneered in areas like South Armagh, North Louth, on the Irish border during the conflict. Now, we have a number of experts here today on the panel who are going to discuss this new connection between criminality and terrorism. So I'll introduce you to our panel. They are Hans-Jakob Schindler, who is a coordinator on the United Nations Security Council, no less, in operations against ISIL, Daesh, Al-Qaida, and Taliban, the monitoring team that looks at those organizations. We have Peter Neumann here, who's the chairman of the Special Representative on Countering Violent Radicalization for the OSCE. He's also Professor of Security Studies at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. We have, and please forgive me, I will get this right, Alvise Giustiani, who's Vice President, Illicit Trade Strategy and Prevention, Corporate Affairs for Philip Morris International Management. And we have Keith Groves, who's the Vice President of Customer Fraud Management Europe for MasterCard. And he works with 14 industry experts located across 10 European countries. So if you've ever had a problem with your credit card and you think it's been chipped or someone's been hacking into it, Keith's the man to talk to. Keith, I would make a quick exit after this.
Thank you very much.
Really
Thank you.
You could be bombarded with queries.
Yeah.
So before our panel introduce and start talking and we have a good discussion in this studio, we're going to have a look at a video now which shows what we're up against in terms of the trade in illegal goods and criminality that funds the terrorism of the 21st century. So let's have a look. Okay, so a little visual food for thought there about the threat and also how it's funded. Peter, there's a report in the London Times today which says that there are 23,000 jihadists living in the United Kingdom. 2 questions. Is that exaggerated? And if it is, are we talking about not just active terrorists, but maybe their supporters, especially those in the financial field?
The number strikes me as very high. Previous numbers were typically around 1,500 to 2,000. I think that's a lot more realistic. I don't see how that figure would have increased tenfold in the last 1 or 2 years. So I would have to read the article to figure out exactly what is meant by that figure. Are these actually potentially violent extremists, or are they also people from this, kind of supporters, sympathizers, or indeed people who may help, sometimes inadvertently, with the funding and financing?
Can you just hone in on that? Inadvertently, in what sense? Are we talking about people who collect money, put money that they think is a good cause, a charity that may end up in the coffers of ISIS?
That's what we used to see. I think one really interesting, and as far as European jihadists are concerned, new phenomenon is that emerging nexus between crime and terror, and people who are being caught up in terrorist networks, like the people in Manchester, to a very significant degree have pasts in criminal networks. So for example, if we look at official figures from various countries, 2/3 of the German foreign fighters, 2/3 of the people who went to Syria in order to join ISIS and similar groups, 2/3 have criminal convictions. In the case of the Netherlands, France, Norway, it is over 50%. That is different from what it used to be maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when that was the exception rather than the rule, and has important consequences in terms of how these people radicalize. It has important consequences in terms of the significance of prisons as breeding grounds. It facilitates terrorist operations because these people typically have easier access to weapons. They're used to violence, so radicalization trajectories happen more quickly. And of course, in terms of the funding, quite often what we see in relation to the funding of terrorist plots is that they are funded by means of quote-unquote ordinary criminality, by drug dealing, trades in counterfeit, and all the range of criminal activities that these people in a previous life used to carry out for profit. Now they carry them out in order to fund terrorist operations.
Hans, the Northern Ireland experience about fuel smuggling is interesting because it was one of the major means to bring in revenue to fund the IRA's armed conflict. That may be over, but can you explain how ISIS and Daesh have zoned in on the fuel industry to fund their campaign in the caliphate and beyond?
Yeah. I mean, I would not say that they zoomed in on the industry on a global scale, right? They zoomed in on the production in Syria by basically conquering all the oil fields in Syria and one oil field in Iraq as a funding stream. So the good news is due to quite sustained military operations over the last year and a half, that has been cut by half. It's still, as far as we can see, the greatest income source for ISIL core in Syria and Iraq. But it's gone down from quite significant levels of hundreds of millions per month to about tens of millions per month, which is good news. But we are dealing with a war economy, so there is a captured market that requires fuel and gas inside Syria. So ISIL will always have a market for that kind of product. And then it, of course, while losing territory, its income is diminishing. What is always a little bit not understood is that also the costs are reducing. So if you are holding Ramadi or Fallujah as cities, you of course can extort the local economy to a large extent, but you also have to run Ramadi and Fallujah, which is significant costs that are involved. And so if ISIL now transforms into less of an emphasis on holding territory and more emphasis on external attack and building a global network to that extent, the income it does have from hydrocarbons and others is still more than sufficient to do that.
But it seems to me if that's the case, that if they have tens of millions, and that's reduced quantity from what they had before, that in terms of running campaigns outside of the Middle East, they could go on for a very, very long time.
Absolutely, and it is actually preparing for that long run at the moment. So there are a few moves that we've seen where the organization adjusts. Obviously, its communication internally has gone into encrypted space, which was something that you could expect. They diluted the command and control downwards, so it's no longer a very hierarchical operations where the top knows everything that's going on, but it's delegated a responsibility downwards. and it is actually sending out money and potentially even individuals out of Syria and Iraq. So a year and a half ago, anyone who wants to leave ISIL got executed as a traitor. Now that's no longer the case. There are first indications that people are actually getting coached on what to say if they cross the border and where they wanted to be extradited to once they are out of Iraq and Syria in order to ensure that they are not going to get arrested. So it's placing people around the world already, and it does the same thing with the money. Obviously, it's still financing every single month its affiliates, in particular Yemen, Afghanistan, West Africa, as well as Somalia. But it's also placing money outside these areas of conflict and in trying to invest them in the illicit economy, apparently in order to prepare for the day where holding territory in Iraq and Syria is not going to be the money-producing aspect for the organization anymore.
Obviously, we saw on the video products, and one of them was the product that your corporation is behind globally. In Ireland, in places like Italy, we had the mafia involved in illicit trade in tobacco. How much has an organization like ISIS got into the racket?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Henry. Just before answering the question, just let me explain why Philip Morris International producer of cigarette is here today. I think the reason is pretty simple, is that every pack of cigarettes sold illicitly is one pack less that we sell. So we have an interest, a business interest, in order to reduce this illicit trade. And the illicit trade, like oil or illicit trade of cigarette, is cigarettes are an easy commodity to trade in, simply because they're easily available, they transport very well, they're not perishable, you can store them, and therefore it makes them a very useful commodity for organized crime to use. Just to give you some an example, some numbers, if you buy a container of cigarettes in some place of the world, which could be Vietnam, Uruguay, Belarus, Dubai, different places of the world, you can buy a container for maybe 100 or 200,000 US dollars. You smuggle that container into a high-price country like Europe, and you can make $2 million. So the return on investment is extremely high, and the risk of being caught and ending up in jail is very low. So organized crime use cigarettes as a mean to fund themselves, but what we see, and there are experts on this panel which are more qualified than myself to speak about it, very much that the terrorism are also getting involved, and even if ISIS, to make that example, are against smoking, they are quite okay if the cigarettes pass their territory and they get a cut on the transit. So I don't think the majority of illicit trade, don't get me wrong, is ending up in the mine of terrorism by all means, but even if it's only a small percentage, I think that's already a very important and something that we should counter. And it's not only about the big money that the terrorists can make, but it also the money that the small cell of terrorists can make. If you take the example of the one that happened in France a couple of years ago of Charlie Hebdo, one of the terrorists was financing himself by selling fake Nike shoes. Once again, a product which is easily available, easily to find. He's not going to make big money, but it's enough to fund his apartment, food, and so on. You're not looking at big money for these cells to operate. But a product like cigarettes, it is something available, and so it's easy for them to use for making some money to finance themselves.
Okay.
So it's not only the big money, the big ISIS, but it's also the terrorists.
That's a good point about even at a small level, it can fund a tiny cell of a terror unit somewhere in Europe or beyond. Keith, I covered a court case a few years ago in Belfast about a jihadist from Algeria. And he was a very prominent character, but he was very much under the radar, lived in Dublin and Belfast, wasn't carrying out attacks on the island, but was planning other stuff in Europe and North America. Two interesting points about the case. One was he was a master bomb maker. We had a CIA explosives officer showing how his device could destroy a plane. But the second thing was he had a mini factory producing fake credit cards, which were to be used around the world presumably by his comrades in what was then Al-Qaida. What is the level of that kind of abuse of and illicit cards and the theft of cards. How has that been? How do they operate?
But in terms of, I guess to answer part of the question around in terms of impact that we see within MasterCard, in terms of fraud globally, it's such a very, very small percentage. You know, it's 0.00 something of the value that's moved in the payment systems. But I guess to our Visa's point of view, you know, it doesn't take a lot of money to commit some of these acts, and I recognise that. And I think Peter mentions as well that a lot of the people that move into terrorism, they've got criminal backgrounds now. And so what I will recognise is some of the financial crimes that are out there, so credit card fraud and payment fraud, in terms of the legal systems, has always been seen as a low impact crime. And so a lot of criminals have enjoyed that ability to commit crime. The risk is low and the reward is generally high, the same as in terms of buying tobacco. So at MasterCard, we're very much about recognising that we're about financial inclusion within the community and ensuring that everybody has access to the payment system. As a security person, as a fraud prevention expert, that comes at a cost sometimes, that the more we open up our network, we know that the bad guys, the criminals, will look at ways of trying to exploit that. So particular to that particular case in Belfast, you know, here in Europe, we've had it for over a decade now. We've moved away from the old magnetic stripe technology. We've moved to chip technology, and MasterCard is a technology leader now. We continue to push the envelope on technology to ensure that we open up the payment network in a healthy way that enables consumers to get access to it, but in a way that makes it more and more difficult for criminality to get in. I mean, for me, criminals will never shy away from trying to come after my payment system. It's advantageous to them. Well, we've got a very high level of security in there now, and globally, the EMV or the chip technology we've enjoyed here in Europe, it's spread across the world globally. North America has got that as well now. So we're starting to squeeze out a lot of the so-called organised crime that try to exploit the weaknesses in the payment system as they perceive it. And so for me, I'm very interested to see where they go next. They won't move away from financial crime in its entirety, but we're certainly making it harder. And what they're having to find now, they have to work a lot harder to make the same amount of money. So criminals are often quite lazy. So if they can't make money, they will move into other areas. And for me, that's where, from a MasterCard perspective, we work very closely with a lot of other companies and industries around the impact of financial crime, and obviously particularly around sort of the brands, damage that's taken in terms of people's products being counterfeited, and our brand being associated with that. That's why we're here today, just to help remind people within MasterCard. We take our brand integrity very strongly, and safety and security is at the heart of a lot of things we do now. We want to eradicate the problem, but we also know that it moves from one industry to another.
Hans, when we talk about ISIS, the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, and okay, it's shrinking, and clearly it's going to shrink further, physically, at least. They do have to work with people. They do have to have allies, don't they, to sell this oil? I mean, are we talking about nation states here? Are we talking about companies, private corporations, or individuals? I mean, what's the evidence in terms of who's helping them shift the oil and make the profits?
Yeah, I mean, the phase where ISIL oil in Syria is sold internationally is over. It's simply because the volumes are no longer there, right? So prior to the conflict, the area that ISIL controls now produced about 115,000 barrels of oil per day. During the conflict, when ISIL took over, we were about 45,000 barrels a day. Now we are around 15 to 20, if that, 1,000 barrels in oil. So there is simply not enough volume. That gets completely absorbed in the market in Syria by everyone in Syria buys oil because that's the monopoly producer. And don't forget, the country is currently under an international embargo for oil. So there is really no other oil to have than to buy from the one who produces it. But there are three issues, I think, here on the panel that needs to be distinguished. One is the ISIL core financing. This is the big headquarter, right? But then there is also, of course, local financing. This is what Peter was referring to, and my colleague from Philip Morris refers to, where cells financing their concrete operation on the spot in their home countries. And then there is the transfer of money. And there, the stored value cards is something that the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, is, among many other things, is currently looking at one way to transfer value from A to B, is to buy stored value cards and then simply sending them either in person or by post to the other party to then get the money off. So these are three different issues that I think get muddled up too much, and there is a clear crime-terror network connection when we're talking about the local financing. There is a clear connection between terrorism and organized crime when we talk about the transport of these goods, antiquities, other goods that they're smuggling. And there is not as strong a connection between a criminal organization and Al-Qaida core in Syria, simply because it's a war situation, right? So yes, there's a lot of crime going on, perpetrated, however, not by professional criminal organizations.
Peter, I once spoke to a senior member of the Ulster Volunteer Force Loyalist terrorist group, and he said that the best suppliers, allies they had were true believers, obviously. So they had a true believer in Canada that was supplying them with weapons in the 1980s. But he said the hardest thing to do to acquire weapons is to work with criminals, because they're easily infiltrated by the state. Many of them are agents of various countries, police forces, and so on. Is that a kind of a defect that even ISIL will have to deal with? The fact is, in a way, the crime nexus works both ways. It can work in favor of the state, where criminals can be bought off and can tip off MI6 or the CIA or whoever.
Sure. It can work both ways, even though in Northern Ireland, the direction was the opposite one. In the case of European jihadists, we see that they are criminals first. So they already are criminals with police records, and then they turn into jihadists. And what in fact we've seen from ISIS is that they have, in some of their online publications, they are encouraging their supporters to act and, in fact, even dress like criminals. So they're saying to people, if you acquire weapons, dress up like a youth from the ghetto. So people think you're a criminal, not a terrorist. In fact, in the case, it's almost a funny story if it wasn't so tragic. In the case of Charlie Hebdo and the hostage-taking at the kosher supermarket that happened afterwards, Amedi Koulibaly, who was the perpetrator of that, who had sworn allegiance to ISIS, he had bought his weapons from the guy who had sold him weapons for years, even when he was still a criminal. And once the attacks happened, that weapons dealer called up the police and self-reported himself. He said, I had no idea. I just thought this guy was an ordinary criminal. Had I known that he's a terrorist, I would have never sold him these weapons.
We have a phrase in Ireland, ordinary decent criminal.
Ordinary decent criminals,
right,
exactly.
Yes, yes.
And so that also makes it problematic, because the people who are involved with these guys, who sell them fake IDs, who sell them weapons, don't necessarily know that these are people who are terrorists. That's the difficult thing about that nexus.
Our two speakers from the private sector, I'd like to know how you obviously have your own intelligence gathering networks and you have your own experts. In what way do you work or connect with the law enforcement agencies of your country, or indeed global bodies? I mean, in what way do you sort of channel the information?
Yeah, sure. Being working in the tobacco industry, we have a lot of knowledge about the distribution system. We track all our products, so each of our pack of cigarettes has a unique identifier. So it's not like on a label of the water you're drinking, where there is a barcode which is the same on all these bottles of water. On our pack of cigarettes, there's a label which is a singular for that single pack. So it's a unique identifier. So we can track this. So this is a valuable piece of information that we have, and we share it with the law enforcement, because the law enforcement clearly has much stronger and tools to do investigations, which we as a company cannot do. But one advantage we have is that we have a global footprint, and we know that the product flowing from one country to another, because we can track it, is valuable information for law enforcement. So we do cooperate a lot, and I think the solution is always having a public-private partnership, because each actor can do part of the puzzle, and you need a comprehensive solution in order to face and to tackle problems of this magnitude.
Do you think there should be an overarching global sort of bridge between private global sort of businesses and international law enforcement?
I am a strong believer that going forward, more than today, the public-private partnership has to be strengthened, simply because the private sector, if you think in some instances, some international company, multinational companies have a geographical footprint which is very big. They have the knowledge, they have the resources, and in many cases, these actors, non-state actors, are bigger than countries. And I was reading the Financial Times, now you mention it, on an article on the first page of today, so maybe many of you have read it, on the G7, where it says the gathering on Sicily agreed to step up efforts to fight terrorism in the wake of the suicide bomber in Manchester, including by pressing big tech companies such as Google and Facebook to do more to suppress terrorism content. So I think this is what big multinational companies should be doing, is to be doing not only because they're pressed, but they should also do it because it's the right thing to do, and there's a win-win for all players.
And Keith?
Yeah, so I sit in a very unique position, I guess, in terms of MasterCard as a payment technology company. I don't actually issue the credit cards or the payment cards. The banks do that in their respective countries.
Just remember that, folks, by the way.
Yeah, so if you want to come to me about problems on your card, I'd love to help you, but I can't. You need to go to your bank. But that's a serious point, and that's where we sit in a nice, unique position that we provide that global network. So one of the things that we do, we work very closely with law enforcement. We do that. The different operations that we support around the world, there's Operation Pangea that Interpol runs around the illicit trade in counterfeit pharmaceuticals. We work very closely with the European Financial Coalition in terms of child abuse and how that's being commercialised. We work in a number of very specific areas to deal with that. And we work with law enforcement globally as well. Interesting for me is the point, I'll just pick up briefly what Hans mentioned about stored value. And this is something that we hear quite regularly around stored value cards, or prepaid cards as people will call them. And for me, from a criminality point of view, they enjoy the ability to hide and disguise their business, money laundering, etc. Cash provides a great opportunity to do that. And for me, one of the advantages of having those stored value cards is that it leaves a footprint. They cannot shy away from the footprint. So actually, whilst I do understand the point being made, the war on cash is greater. That's such a much greater hidden trade that we don't expect to see. So certainly from a law enforcement perspective, yes, we work very closely with a lot of agencies to do that in a very proactive manner as well. And certainly in my industry, as payments continue to grow and the internet continues to boom, we've all got payment devices now on a handset. It's truly global. So we certainly see an absolute role in supporting law enforcement and at government level as well, in that matter as well.
Peter, I heard a phrase last night which I thought was excellent. It was coined by an ex-British police officer working with to de-radicalize and prevent young people getting sucked into the kind of jihadist networks. And it was the cyber caliphate. And what he said was that the cyber caliphate will replace the physical one if and when the readouts in Syria and Iraq are completely shrunk. That ISIS moves to cyberspace to direct its campaign. If that's the case, and surely there is a lot of money sloshing around in its war chest, this is going to go on for a long time, and it will be more Manchester-style attacks rather than, taking over the likes of Ramadi and Raqqa and so on.
For sure. I think there's a cyber caliphate already, and there has been for a number of years. I think it's important to kind of understand what's going on. If over the past 5 years, over 30,000 people from 100 different countries have traveled to Syria, joined jihadist groups. It's probably the most significant mobilization of foreign fighters in the Muslim world that has ever taken place. The second most significant was the anti-Soviet jihad in the 1980s in Afghanistan. And of course, what happened in Afghanistan in 1988 was that the conflict ended, and all these up to 20,000 people who had traveled there, including Osama bin Laden, asked themselves, what now? What's next? And then, as a result of a conflict that happened in the 1980s, in the 1990s and 2000s, you had these so-called veterans of the conflict turn up in other conflicts, from Bosnia to Chechnya to Algeria to the Philippines, typically making these conflicts worse and more religiously extreme. And you also had some of these people getting together to form an international terrorist network that ultimately carried out the attacks on 9/11. But here's the important thing. The attacks on 9/11 happened 2001. That's 13 years after the end of the conflict in Afghanistan. So we're now talking about the Manchester attacks, and the conflict in Syria hasn't even ended. All these fighters haven't even had to ask themselves the question, what next? The clock hasn't even started ticking yet. So I don't think this will end anytime soon. I think there will be consequences of what's happened in Syria for many years to come. And that's why it's so important that we think about these consequences and start preparing ourselves.
Just before I throw this open to the audience, Hans, Alvise said a very interesting thing about Google, Facebook. And given that we're talking about the increasing importance of the cyber caliphate, what can the big high-tech social media organizations do to be part of this countering this threat online and then in physical space?
Yeah, so let me just put this terminology, cyber caliphate, a little bit in context, right? So there was for a while a thinking that if, because ISIL's emphasis on holding territory, if you take the territory of the organization, you solved your problem, right? That was in the mind of a lot of the policymakers, and rightfully the military campaign was initiated to take the territory off to decrease the funding, but that's not solving the problem. That's simply phase one, right? And so we're now entering phase two, where it's no longer about the physical territory. The cyber caliphate is simply a means by which the network will get directed, right? So it's not about conquering space in cyberspace. It's looking at the internet as an operational tool, and that's what we are working on at the moment in New York. So obviously there's a lot of privacy and freedom of speech issues involved in here, but there are also very clear operational aspects. If we're talking about terrorist communication with each other, if we're talking about the dissemination of knowledge, and particularly on ID designs, right? And quite a few attacks have now begun also in Europe to use IDs. And if we're talking about financing, calls for financing, transferring of money using tools within the internet. And that's where I think there is a great opportunity for a stronger public-private partnership. I'm not saying it's not happening already. You have already here in New York, in Europe, the Internet Referral Unit at Europol that works with tech companies on issues of terrorist content on their websites. But more can be done, right? More can be done on identifying who is using your products by these companies, and identifying what are the products precisely used for, and what are, according to their own terms and services, legitimate and not legitimate uses.
Peter just wanted to add there, didn't
just a couple more things, because I think that's really important. That's a really important area. The first is the mistake that was made in 2011 should not be repeated. In 2011, we mistook a movement for an organization. Al-Qaida Central was defeated, and everyone in Washington, D.C. concluded the threat is over. But in fact, of course, we're dealing with a movement, the jihadist Salafist movement. I have no doubt that in 5 years' time, there will still be a movement. I do not know what particular organization will lead that movement. I have no idea. Personally, I rather doubt that in 5 years' time, the Islamic State will still be as important as it is now. But there will still be a movement, and they will perhaps transform into a different organization. And one of the most important debates and most exciting and interesting debates that is currently starting within the jihadist movement, that is not over, is precisely how supporters will respond to the decline of the caliphate. I mean, yes, I absolutely agree, it's not the end of the story, but in 2014, the leader of Islamic State declared essentially a 1,000-year Reich. The territorial strategy was, in many ways, the unique selling point of Islamic State. 2 years later, that caliphate and that state is crumbling. And of course, there are supporters of Islamic State who are now asking questions, and who are saying, how can it be that something that was declared to be remaining and expanding forever is now falling apart? And how will we respond to it? What does that mean for the legitimacy of the entire project?
Well, given that we're probably going to expect a mutating neo-Islamic State or something else, it's going to need to finance itself. So with that in mind, let's throw it open to the audience and for any thoughts on the nexus between crime and terrorism in the 21st century. So go ahead, this gentleman here. Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I I'm surprised that you're using the Khilafat so easily, which is an Islamic term and has a positive meaning. So the way you're talking it is, unfortunately, I hear it that you talk directly to Al-Qaida, to ISIS, to all the extreme groups who are not even representing 1 or 2% of the Islamic world. So, excuse me, I apologize for that one, that this communication is in fact giving them the grounds to recruit more. So it means you are accepting them as representative of the Islamic world, which is not your intention, definitely. And we should in fact be more careful, being in the West, and in fact we need to find out the success story of our own society here, Muslim community, in each of these respected nations. They are the success story. They know better, in fact, about the Islamic world to come and be exposed on your front page of the media, not all the time explosion, or not all the time quoting, in fact, the extreme groups. Don't you think that we are failing in that context? We are not doing much. We are not bringing the success story of our own nations here. The Muslims are not an Islamic world. We have Muslims in each of single countries. Why do you address Muslim like in only Middle East? Muslims in each country are your success stories, your main partners. Most of the panels, I don't see any Muslims who are really speaking from the Islamic point of view or being a Muslim scholar. Only somebody who did the dissertation on Islam or some kind of things, they come and speak about this faith. I think we are losing more in the core. We are not having the right people, not addressing that one, and more giving the ground for the extremists to recruit more. Thank you. And not finding out, in fact, the elephant in the room, which countries are, in fact, feeding, sponsoring that one, instead of exposing them because of the great man and woman in your uniforms. They died because of this conflict. We are even making deals of weaponry with them who are not even having an army or soldiers. Thank you.
Hans, do you maybe want to respond to that?
No, I mean, I agree with the fact that you need to engage the Muslim communities here in Europe stronger and highlight the positive aspects, and that there is a danger to see that all terrorists are Muslims. And I hope I wasn't misunderstood when I was talking about the financing aspects. I wasn't trying to legitimize a state-building project of the Islamic group here. And the Security Council has been very careful in its wording, actually. As far as words like caliphate or jihad is concerned, and you didn't hear me use the word jihad. So it is absolutely a word of terminology, and obviously the work on the root causes is an important thing. However, if you look at the European jihadists, and I'm sure Peter can talk to this in more detail, it's really hard to find a profile. Right? So it's not the disenfranchised only, or the unemployed only, or the uneducated only. So it's not the ones who are in any way, objectively speaking, marginalized from society that join, but it's also your university graduate, your engineer, your doctors are joining. So there is obviously a problem of identity here, right? So can you be German and Muslim? And that is a discussion that the society needs to have. What does it mean to be a Muslim in Germany? And that should be done, I take Germany as an example because I come from there. But that's a conversation that each society has to have with their Muslim community of what it means to be European and Muslim at the same time. And there are many success stories. But this phenomenon showed that there is really, at least in a small part of society, a crisis of identity, and therefore clear-cut, extremely radical ideas that says, the world falls neatly into good and bad, and here are clear ways of what good is, and everything else, by definition, is therefore bad, is maybe an attractive offer.
And I agree with most of your points. I just want to say something about the terminology, because that's something that I think we always kind of make too complicated. And having been in these debates for 20 years, there's always someone who stands up and says, oh, the true meaning of jihad, and why do you talk about Islam? And of course, I'm not speaking to an audience who's likely to be radicalized. We are, I hope so at least. I'm speaking to an expert audience, and I do not expect any of you to easily fall prey to the terminology that is being used. When we talk about the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, we're not, by using that term, we're not implying that they are the true inheritors of the Irish Republican tradition. When during the Cold War, we were talking about East Germany by its official name, the German Democratic Republic, I don't think there were many who believed that there was anything democratic about East Germany. That's how these entities call themselves, and I think it's okay to call themselves by what they call themselves. And that does not mean that I buy into it. I absolutely don't. But in the case of Islamic State, there is an important thing, which is that this group calls itself Islamic State. We don't like that. But I think we're missing an important aspect of that organization if we just refer to it as a terrorist group. Because that group sees itself very much as a state. It acts as a state. It has a bureaucracy, a very complicated bureaucracy. It has an army, or what it sees as an army. When last year those 20,000 documents of Islamic State were captured, journalists were asking me, how can it be that a terrorist organization is keeping records on its members? And my answer was, it's precisely because that group doesn't see itself as a terrorist organization. It sees itself as a state, and it looks at these recruits as members of its army. So I think the state aspect, whether we like it or not, is actually a very important characteristic of the group that we're dealing with because they see themselves as a state.
Has anyone else in the audience any thoughts about the nexus with crime? I mean, and the fact is, in many ways, that anyone, I suppose, who's buying it as a consumer in the illicit market, whatever it is, could be inadvertently guilty of funding terrorism in the 21st century. So just a thought to throw out to the audience. Sir?
Thank you for the interesting remarks so far. Terrorist groups have been fairly entrepreneurial about adopting high-tech solutions to their communications needs. We've talked about stored value cards, but I have to believe that with everything happening in fintech and money laundering by criminal groups in the high-tech world, I'm surprised that you haven't talked about the potential for the cybercrime nexus and jihad coming together in the money laundering and criminality space. If anybody has any remarks on that. I was fascinated to learn that each pack of cigarettes has its own identifier code, but that opens up all sorts of possibilities for, well, many actors. Anyway.
Maybe Keith and Alvese could field that question in particular, in terms of...
I'll happily take the first part in terms of, I think for me it's interesting. So I'm a fraud prevention expert, that's how I consider myself to be. And for me, I look at it in a very simple way. Someone's trying to break into my system to somehow take value out of that. And for me, it's as simple as that. In the last 5-6 years, the word cyber has grown to mean so many things to so many people that I think we're losing sight of some of the actors that are involved in cybercrime. So in the card payment business, I hear now a lot of so-called cyber criminals are attacking the payment system. And here in Europe, we suffered a huge ransomware attack in the last couple of weeks. Certainly, I felt that close to home, having been in hospital on the day it happened. And so the impact of cyber is so broad and wide now, I think people don't truly understand what it means. But in terms of do I see terrorist groups or so-called terrorist groups looking at the payment system as a means of moving money around and using that to fund their activities, I don't recognise that in the way that we talk about some of the acts that we're talking about here. I agree, as you mentioned, the case in Belfast. I see isolated cases of that, but it's not systemic. But what I do see is quite often cash being used and moved around by criminals to move value between different groups. So the stored value one for me, again, is interesting. If I look at the legislation that's moving through in certain countries in Europe, AML4, is the value in some of these stored cards is so small and so minimal, it doesn't really play any advantage to criminals. And again, it comes back to the moment you electronify the value, actually I can trace it, I can see where it goes, and I can tell you where it went in and where it came out. So actually, from a criminal and from a terrorist perspective, the payment systems aren't useful for them to do that. They can move money around, I won't disagree with that comment, but it leaves an audit and a trail. And if these guys want to operate in the shadows and not get caught, then they don't want to do that. And the last comment I will make, just to talk about the internet as well, we're starting to see a lot of the mainstream criminality, the hackers who trade in data, they're getting pushed now into the so-called dark web, and they're getting pushed into the corners, which from a mainstream payment system, that's good for me, because it means a lot of my customers don't fall victim to scams on the internet, because they don't trust it. And I know with my brand being misused to supposedly legitimise a corrupt business offering or a website or whatever, it means now that people are becoming less and less prone to becoming victim of that. And a lot still are, but we're making the job more difficult within our industry.
We'll have and Hans again, and then another question in the audience. But go ahead.
Yeah. I think that you have a point. Cyber, as much as I understand the cyber attacks, is a world which we're only starting to discover. So your point is very much valid. Tracking every pack of cigarettes means that we're going to have a huge amount of data which can be hacked. So definitely a valid point. I'll just add two things to it. First, what you also mentioned about the value of each pack is quite small. So there's that which is is a natural defense against cyber attacks, which we haven't seen so far on our databases. But on the other hand, so far, the industry has voluntarily tracked their products, and as of 2019, there's a European directive on tobacco, which will regulate that all tobacco circulating in Europe will have to have a unique identifier on each single pack. So in 2 years' time, in May 2019, when this directive goes into force, then the problem could really balloon and be much bigger, because it's going to be for all Europe, all tobacco products. So, valid point.
I mean, and two things on the high-tech issue. So obviously there was a great concern around cryptocurrencies, right? Bitcoin and others. 4 cases internationally so far, right? So it's not yet there. Simply, our interpretation of what's going on is they just don't need it yet, right? It's still much easier, much better, much securer to move money via money service providers, hawaladas, who are unregulated in most countries, and so there is really no clear overview of how much cash flows in and out from these on a global scale, and by money carriers, right? So as long as you keep underneath the international barrier of 10,000 equivalent in your local currency of 10,000 US dollars by entering a country, you don't even have to declare that you bring the money with you. So moving money in small amount, and don't forget, this is not a commercial enterprise. This is not about time is money. Time is in unlimited supplies. So if you need to move $1 million via 100 carriers and that takes you 4 months, that's the way you do it. Because that's simply the safest way to get your cash across. On the stored value cards, before we completely leave this out, yes, you can see where they're bought, potentially by whom, if they don't pay in cash. And yes, you can see by where they get out, if they don't, if they, again, try to use electronic means. But you don't know who is behind that, right? So it's a transfer mechanism. I'm not saying it's a big problem. I'm just saying this is one issue which is fairly simple, because you don't have to devolve your address details if you buy a stored value card, and I just did that last night, for 100 euros. I had not to present any identity. So yes, of course, in that shop, a stored value card for 50 euros was bought, but by whom, no one knows. I paid in cash, done, right? So there is it's a simple mechanism that is there that we provide as a society, as an economy, that is easy to be misused to transport small amounts, mind you. But when we're talking about the financing of, not of ISIL, but of individual attacks, small amounts is what counts. You don't need $1 million for Manchester. You needed, if I don't remember correctly, $115,000 all in, including flights and training for 9/11. Paris was much cheaper, and I'm quite sure that Manchester will come in way beyond that mark. So $100 does get you a long way in that respect.
Sorry, this gentleman here in the second row would like, could we just get a microphone? And then there's that gentleman there and that gentleman there. Thank you. If you can keep your questions pretty succinct.
Thank you. What aspects of financing of ISIL are particular to the group compared to financing other fighting groups? You know, the situation in the Triple Frontier in Paraguay, Brazil is something that's very often talked about to fund some other militant groups. So what are the things that we can learn from fighting the financing of other groups applied to Daesh and the things that are particular to Daesh? Thank you.
Right. Generally speaking, there are four types of means by which groups like that fund themselves. The first is getting support from supporters, whether it is state funding or voluntary contributions by people who they claim to represent. The second is income that results from participating in illicit economies. That's where we see a lot of smuggling, for example. Third aspect is legitimate income. That's what makes it different from money laundering, for example. Because when you're dealing with criminal money, you're trying to launder it into legitimate money. Terrorist funding can be legitimate to begin with. It becomes dirty by the purpose for which it is used. So no one questions, for example, that Osama bin Laden was wealthy. He was wealthy and his money was legitimate. He inherited it from his father. It became dirty by the way he used it, not how he acquired it. And of course, we've seen that in Northern Ireland in a number of cases. And the fourth method of income is what we've seen, particularly in case of Islamic State, which is the exploitation of territory. And that's what happens when terrorist groups transform into insurgencies, hold territory, can start taxing their people, can start generating income from natural resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem then becomes, when these groups hold territory, that the entire structure of international counter-terrorist finance stops to work, because we know that ISIL had a budget of 1.7 billion perhaps in 2015, but of course most of that money was completely disconnected from the international financial system. And that's why I'm saying we have to really rethink how we counter terrorist financing. When we have groups that hold territory, which by and large do not participate in the international financial system, and then we have the local manifestations of these groups who are essentially self-funding and who carry out terrorist attacks that basically cost nothing, that cost less than $1,000. The most expensive terrorist act over the past 2 years was the truck attack in Nice, because that truck cost $300 to rent. All the other attacks with knives, with cars, were cheaper than that. So you have to ask yourself the question, what is the utility of our current ways of countering terrorist finance when we're dealing with a modus operandi that doesn't involve the moving of a lot of money? If I was a policymaker, I would say, instead of putting more layers on the international banking system, let's fight petty crime, knowing that a lot of these jihadists have criminal backgrounds, benefit from drug dealing, benefit from criminal networks. That seems to be a more efficient way of targeting terrorist finance than trying to look for suspicious transactions that only become suspicious if you know that that person is a suspect in the first place.
Okay, two more. Maybe we'll bunch these two questions together, if you wouldn't mind. We'll have both of them simultaneously.
Okay, the last question is very close to what I wanted to ask. I wanted to hear other schemes. For example, I'd heard using used automobiles, the stored value there, and transferring that across borders, but also the other transfers through charitable organizations, direct transfers from other people who want to do it. What percent of that is financing terrorism, and how effective are we in terms of shutting some of those other types of financing mechanisms down?
And this gentleman here, please.
So, Director Cristiani, Massachusetts College. Actually, I'm surprised that we are talking about organized crime without mentioning Italy. And I come from Naples, so I have direct experience of certain things. If we look at the history of the three major Italian mafias, like Camorra, 'Ndrangheta, and Mafia, they actually grew in connection with the state. I mean, it's not like a secret that Cavour used Camorra to guarantee Garibaldi when he was coming to Naples. So now, and also, now we are talking about the Islamic State, but if we look at other jihadi organizations, I think AQAM, we have seen in the operational shift that Algerian terrorists has known in the past 10 years, that they turned from a pure jihadist organization to a sort of hybrid organization. And we even had smugglers like Abu Zayed who turned to be major leaders without, mentioning Bel Mokhtar, of course. In those, do you think there are some state responsibilities in this rise, in the sense that certain states of the region in North Africa or in the Middle East, they didn't do as much as they could to stop this emergence because of lack of capacities, but also because the interest of some people in making money out of these traffics? And the second point is, in Italy sometimes, talking about ways to stop this phenomenon, do you think there are experiences around Europe and the world that can be used as an example? Naples in the 90s was flooded with contraband like cigarettes, and now this phenomenon doesn't exist anymore, or in any case, has been reduced. Italy, from this point of view, between the 90s and the new century, made a number of changes that allowed to reduce significantly this type of traffics. And the third point is, if they are making money out of drug smuggling, should we liberalize drugs just to cut completely this kind? I know this is a bit of a provocation.
We like provocation. That's a very provocative point. Let me start with that one. The legalization of drugs will undermine global criminality and funding terrorism. There you go.
Look, if you look at Afghanistan, you do see a very close connection between the drug production areas and areas where the Taliban hold control, right? So there it really is, it's really hard to distinguish where the drug network ends and the Taliban start. Taliban got financed initially by three of the major drug dealers in Afghanistan in the setup of the movement. So this has been a very close marriage on that one.
But Hans, was it not the case that when NATO tried to clamp down on the poppy production, that the farmers started to support the Taliban again because they promised they could continue to produce?
No, because the Taliban are very much, this is not about NATO climbing down. This is, the Taliban are involved in all stages of the production. So one thing that needs to be understood is that you cannot generate seeds out of your harvest. So you need an external seeds provider for your poppy harvest. That was the Taliban. Then, of course, you need money to live until the harvest. So the Taliban afforded credit schemes to the farmers, which magically always were more than the expected yield of the field and the profit that the farmer could generate. So the farmer was in internal debt to the Taliban. And therefore, you see Taliban forces wavering according to the harvest times. So there are 2 harvests in Afghanistan, and when there's harvest time, there is a significant drop in violence every single year, because the farmers are now on the fields and no longer with the Taliban, because they are in a dependent relationships to the Taliban. So it wasn't NATO climbing down, it was the Taliban having a grip on that industry, which incidentally is not a traditional industry in Afghanistan. It started, funnily enough, in the fight against the Soviet Union, where the Mujahideen discovered that heroin production is a neat way to finance your activities. So this is a long-standing problem, but not as long as people assume. Afghanistan did not used to be the main producer of heroin in the world. So that's where you see a very close connection. And the rest is where you see terrorist groups infusing themselves in the flow of illicit goods, right? So you mentioned Mokhtar Belmokhtar, who incidentally, and this is important, I'm sure the colleague from Philip Morris knows that, is also known as Mr. Marlboro, because he was very much involved in the Marlboro smuggling activities, but not in the producing of Marlboros, but in making sure Marlboros went from A to B. So that's where we see on the drug side the infusion of terrorists, because drugs flow and illicit activities flow where governance is weak. And where governance is weak, terrorism is very likely to happen, right?
Another issue raised by one of the members of the audience was the abuse of charity. Now, given terrorism on the cheap, what are your thoughts on that? The guy standing outside, somewhere rattling a tin, and you don't know where the money's going to. How important can that be? And what can be done to monitor it?
This is where we see the risk at the moment. We did not see ISIL trying to elicit a lot of external funding for the last few years. The argument was always the organization wants not to be dependent on external funders, i.e. generous donors, who usually give money with a condition attached to it. However, as now, and then ISIL has proven the concept, this is an answer to the other gentleman's question, has proven a few concepts here, right? So exploiting oil fields, good way to make money, especially in conflict zones. Smuggling antiquities, perfect way to make money, and they're still acting, although they're no longer looting as much as they used to before, as service provider for everyone else who loots antiquities in Syria and Iraq. So you can not only need to hold territory to make money out of antiquities. So it proved a few very innovative concepts. Now, as this gets more difficult as the territory shrinks, there is, of course, this danger that you have, again, trying to procure funds by asking donors, in particular misusing charity organizations. So as we've seen in Afghanistan with Wafa and Al-Haramain, where entire NGOs were set up for the purpose of funding Al-Qaida in Afghanistan, the risk that this is going to happen again. And here is where the current situation is a tricky one, because obviously you want funds in large amounts flow into areas like Ramadi, Fallujah, and other areas, then hopefully soon Mosul in Iraq to rebuild. However, as these are high-risk areas, you will not be able to, as a charity organization, get a bank account, which means there is absolutely no view of the flows that go into that territory. That, in combination with ISIL potentially looking again to misuse money flows from charitable organizations, is a really dangerous situation, because if you have $100 million flowing in and you have no idea who, how much, when, and where it's received, then you do have a big problem. On the other hand, on the commercial banking side, where the compliance officers decide to de-risk, it's a situation where no government so far can give them straight guidelines of what are the compliance criteria. If you have a multi-nation funded aid project, you have as many compliance requirements, different compliance requirements, as you have nation states funding the project. So the compliance manager in the bank has no way to gauge his risk for his organization. So the only logical conclusion is to completely de-risk any charity organization. So that's a big problem.
Sorry, you just wanted to get in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe respond to my Italian compatriot about all the questions he asked. One is, what have we learned from Italy in the last 30, 40 years on defeating or contain mafia and the Camorra? I think one is that a law that was passed in Italy many years ago was to seize the properties of the Camorristi and the mafiosi, and I think that one actually worked. There was an anecdote of one of the big bosses of the, don't remember his name anymore, but he said that, put me in prison, take away my freedom, but don't take away my properties. I mean, when it touches the properties, it's really you touch the end. So this law, you could know better, I forget to remember. But anyway, that was one thing. And the other thing is, you say, is the connection between these organizations and the politics? I think the answer is obviously yes. And I think in the tobacco industry, we see that as well. I mentioned beforehand, and it's nothing new, the president of Paraguay has been known to produce cigarettes in his country. And actually, there was a Congress hearing in the Congress in the United States a couple of weeks ago where Mr. Ottolenghi said exactly that, the president of Paraguay is the biggest producer of cigarettes. He produces 60 billion cigarettes, where the market absorbs 3 billion. So 60 billion produced, 3 billion consumed in his country. Where do the other 57 billion end up? Smuggled into Brazil and the other countries, and that's done at the light of the sun, so everybody can see it. But you have other examples in Belarus, but also in the Middle East, in Dubai. There's plenty of cigarette producers in Dubai which are producing there to basically export abroad, and do the Emirates know it? That's a question you can answer.
Any other questions in the audience? Anyone want to contribute? Anything? Yes, someone over there. Is there? Yes, over here, right at the far wall.
First, thank you. It's Martina Sassoludi from Germany. We are currently running some projects on these issues. Not that deep as you did, Peter Neumann, but We're just beginning, and we had an interesting dinner session yesterday on this issue. And first, I would like to just make some remarks on the discussion that took already place. That I think it's a really good point when you name the people or the subjects that we talk about with the names that they give themselves. So this is the modern thing. If you want to be a German Muslim, you are a German Muslim. This is the new modern concept of identity. We cannot pose identity upon them. If they call themselves jihadists, they are jihadists. In my point of view, that's how I treat people when they constitute their identity. The second thing was the cyber caliphate. We had it yesterday. Yes, we will still have this ideology staying there, and we will still have some veterans. They are experienced in war zones. So these two things will not go away. The topic that I would like to hear maybe a bit more about is the state that you were talking about, that IS was different because it is a state, it has a bureaucracy, and it was the first time that we see that flood of women because they wanted to build up a state, to have a new community for Muslims and so on, from their point of view, the Muslim way. And yesterday we had a session here where it was about the Middle East. So we heard that terrorism is very cheap. I think radicalization is more expensive, so to keep the whole thing running is more expensive. But when we think that you have the geostrategic setting in the Middle East, that the IS only could develop, could only emerge, and could only become as big because we had a Sunni-Shia divide. I reduce complexity now. Yesterday it was a whole hour that I was speaking about that. But this will not change as long as we will not change Iraq and the Syria setting, so that many people who gave power to this kind of organizations in order to be represented in a kind of maybe Sunni state, it will not change. And this makes then the question, maybe we relate it closer to the subjects that we are talking about today. So terrorist attacks in Europe are not expensive, yes. Maybe it makes sense to look at the petty crime, yes. But the broader movement and the narrative and the future veterans and the future conflicts that will be invaded by these veterans, because they are parasites of war, as I call them. They appear everywhere where you have a conflict, and then you have an inflammation. How can we cope with the situation in the Middle East and bring it in relation to Europe? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's have a reply to that, please. Okay.
Wow, I mean, having followed the turmoil in the Middle East for the past 6 years, I'm very humble and very modest when it comes to predictions, because I've seen over the past 6 years so many experts that I truly respect as experts get it completely wrong. I do think what happens in the Middle East, and again, that is my opinion, is a truly historical transformation that is perhaps in some ways comparable to the 30-year war in Europe in the 17th century. And just like no one knew in the middle of the 30-year war that it would one day become the 30-year war and what would be at the end of it, I don't think anyone can say with certainty what will be at the end of this truly historical transformation. ISIS is only one aspect of it. We have, as you pointed out, a sectarian conflict. We have internal conflicts within a lot of countries between authoritarians, Islamists, representatives of perhaps more democratic ideas. We have a number of countries in which we have no effective governance, and the conflicts seem to be particularly bad in those countries where several of these fault lines coincide. So in Syria, you have a conflict about governance, you have a sectarian conflict, and you have the jihadists. In Yemen, you have the same situation. And I'm not going to predict exactly what's going to come out of it. I feel that probably whatever is going to come out of it will not resemble how we started in 2011. That I'm certain of. And that's the really difficult challenge for policymakers in Moscow and in Washington, because a lot of policy has been geared essentially towards preserving the 2011 state order. If we now accept that perhaps that cannot be preserved, should we continue to invest a lot of energy into keeping the borders where they are, or should we embrace and form and shape a new order? I don't know the answers to that. That's what I started with, and that's how I'm going to finish.
Can I have someone else here from the audience who's been put down to speak? Get the microphone, please. Thank you. And it's like, just to remind you that if we can focus on this particular subject on crime, finance, and the support of terrorist entities. Thank you. It is Lisa Doucette, of course.
Yes, I want to focus on Peter's last question, which is very provocative. Lisa Doucette from the BBC. I wonder if you could talk more broadly about the flows of money, which are long known to have come from the wealthy Gulf states. At this point, but you mentioned the Afghan war, the biggest movement of them. There's been a lot of money going from wealthy Gulf states to Syria, to Iraq, to other countries. And that's both private, through the foundations, through fundraising at mosques, and official. Now, we're told in countries like Saudi Arabia that they have stopped the official money going, and that now they have tightened up on their financing. So it's almost, I was told in Riyadh, it's almost impossible now to send money anywhere. But yet the allegations both there and in other countries persist. How important are these flows? And of course, this is even more important after the Riyadh summit, where there was a new Arab and Islamic leaders standing together with President Trump to say they're going to fight extremism and the ideology. Thank you.
Can I briefly respond to that? Because that's a really important point, Lise, because it goes back to the question before, because ultimately it really again comes down to that tired phrase, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And there are questions of legitimacy. And certainly we are quick to forget. But in 2011, 2012, the West supported the so-called rebels in Syria. It is true that they radicalized since then, but we should not be surprised that a lot of countries in the Gulf region, essentially until 2013-14, essentially viewed the conflict in Syria as part of the larger confrontation between Sunnis and Shiites. And being Sunni, they basically supported everyone on their side. Some of that money ended up with extremist Salafist organizations. And that's when they stopped it. They stopped it, a lot of it did, and they stopped it at the point when they realized that it would come back to haunt them. But essentially, until 2013, it was essentially seen as supporting our side in a regional conflict. And a lot of the charities from Kuwait, from Saudi, from Qatar, that were involved in funding the opposition in Syria did so, sometimes with the explicit support of Western countries. So let's not forget about that, because our view of that conflict has changed too. Well, he probably knows more about that than I do.
So I get the difficult part of the question, right?
Yes.
Look, I mean, first of all, donor money is not necessarily only coming from the Gulf states, right? There is quite a lot of donor money actually coming out of Europe. Sympathizers of the Germans, of the French, of the Italians, of the UK guys who are fighting with ISIL, right? And the Secretary General at the end of this month in a report that we helped him draft is going to highlight the problem of dead drop bank accounts, where European foreign fighters maintain their personal bank accounts and sympathizers put money in those bank accounts in Germany, in UK, in Italy, in France, and it gets withdrawn outside the conflict zone by simply using their normal bank card, right? So that's an easy, nice way to transfer money using the official banking system where all of the controls fails because no money moves. It goes in the account and out of the account. So that's financing that has nothing to do with the Gulf states. That's coming out of Europe, right? Simply using the fact that everyone in Europe has a bank account. In a very, very smart way. So it's not just donors in the Gulf. It's also donors in the Gulf. And it used to be donors in the Gulf, mainly for Al-Qaida. But as I said, so far currently, and we're talking about the risk assessment of charities, not the actual ongoing situation. So far, ISIL has not put a large emphasis. There was always going donor money towards ISIL, and it continues to do so from individuals. But it has not yet set up a system like Al-Qaida did when it was running the camps in Afghanistan, where entire charities were set up under the guise of doing good work in Afghanistan. Wafa Foundation, right, building roads in Afghanistan, and as a side job, building the camps for Al-Qaida in Afghanistan. That has not happened yet. But as the internal financial streams are going to get more difficult, this is a potential that it's going to happen again.
Keith, can I just interject with a question about that particular money network? Supporters in Sheffield say getting money from abroad, recycling the money from their own bank account in an English city somewhere. How is there any way to trace that and to disrupt that network?
But I guess from a technology perspective, one of the things we advocate at MasterCard is improving on security, and a lot of that is driven by how people access those financial instruments. So we're very much behind biometrics. We believe that's strategically where we need to go in terms of improving security. So I guess this is not my area of expertise, but I suspect what we'll start to see is the fact that we will actually force people to be the only people who can access their bank accounts, which is what I would like to have happen, which means they then can't share those credentials with somebody else. You can't move your fingerprint or your retinas around to other people to use. So what we'll see is, again, by having the traditional banking systems, the security improved upon, that will have an impact of squeezing the problem. And it will go somewhere else. And I won't go back to the cash conversation, but we'll continue to do that. And for me, within payments, and certainly at MasterCard, as the technology continues to improve on that, it just exposes so much of criminality to being seen more obviously. And I think that in this context, we're going to see that start to happen, that shift where people won't be able to share those financial instruments will go, and it will push them back to going up good old cash. It works.
And this gentleman here wants to thank you for that.
Thank you, and just want to follow up on that point because I was at the previous session on artificial intelligence, and we were talking about petty crime. It's shadow economy producing money for terrorism. And I'm sure that tax office, the financial watchdogs, so many organizations are dealing with these kinds of social activities. So is it possible that finally we will produce a software or anything that can follow up on patterns of activities that you can join databases to follow up so that when Philip Morris recognizes something, can you bring some really good examples what has happened already in the past in an interagency operation of at that level when it's really petty crimes, not Gulf states pouring millions into Bosnia, but when these small things happen in our own countries, so we have the legal right to act and to monitor, but still we need an interagency operation.
I guess from a financial perspective, is we work very closely with the enforcement agencies, so particularly here in Europe with Europol, and they conduct very good, well-organised and coordinated activities, and certainly Interpol play that role as well. So as an example then, I'll talk about the movement of human beings around the world and using airlines to conduct that. And to move people around on airlines, you need to pay for that. And traditionally, they don't want cash, they'll want electronic payments. So it's going to happen very shortly. Every year, the payment industry get together collaboratively with the travel industry and the airline sector and with law enforcement, and we partner together to share real-time intelligence on what we suspect to be people being moved from one country to another, either against their will or unbeknowingly what they're going to end up arriving at to do in that particular country. And we share that intelligence. That's a model that we certainly endorse at MasterCard, is that public-private partnership approach we mentioned earlier on in there. And we do similar things. I mentioned Pangaea and illegal pharmaceuticals. That ability for us to do that is very powerful, and we're very good at disrupting those networks. And again, what we do with that is work with law enforcement very closely. The byproduct of that always is that eventually the organised criminals will work out the methods that we use, as most people in the room know, and they'll come up with something else. And what we're seeing in my industry is we're slowly pushing that out into areas where general consumers won't go. And certainly some of the work we've done, you mentioned the shadow economy, and particularly in this part of Europe, there's a huge amount of cash and money being moved around in the shadow economy that doesn't touch my payment system. And we certainly advocate for the fact that the more we can move cash out of the cash system into the electronic system, we can continue to have that working relationship with law enforcement and with governments and regulators as well, to basically ensure that people who don't have access to financial instruments can get it into the system. They don't have to rely on cash. And that then exposes that money for the view of governments if we talk about taxation, and that money can be taken back into the system and redeployed and invested where it's needed for the better of the community. So we try to play that 360 view at MasterCard regularly.
Okay. I just remembered I once asked a former paramilitary, how do you move money about if you don't want to use the banking system, if you don't want it to be traced? Yeah. And one thing he said, a brilliant place to do is nail bars. Buy a nail bar, because money is moving all the time. People are getting their nails in every 15 minutes. It's a great way to recycle the cash quickly and keep your profits up. And that actually leads to a question, a serious question about property. It was mentioned there, I think somebody from the audience mentioned it. We have a lot of examples in Ireland where underground organisations buy a lot of property. I mean, I was in a restaurant in Belfast 2 months ago, and I mentioned it to someone who's an ex-member of the IRA Belfast Brigade, and he says, we own that place, we own that restaurant, right? Now, it's been owned for retirement purposes. They've given someone a job, but it's their restaurant. Is there evidence that the property market around the world that organisations like ISIS are moving into as well?
Well, there is one quite striking example. It's not ISIL or Al-Qaida related, it's actually Taliban. They parked, I think, about $100 million in a country in the Pacific by basically using the immigrant community and making them an offer that they can't refuse. So you buy a house, we give you the money. You can live in the house, but when we need the money, you will sell the house. And so the whole scheme broke down when it was clear that entire streets in one town were owned by Afghan immigrants who had no conceivable economic way, and all houses cost about $500,000 Australian dollars, had no conceivable way to actually earn that money to buy that house. So this was a placement scheme, but that's the only one that I'm aware of where this was done on a very large scale, not to finance anything, but to park money for the time when it's needed, and to make sure that you have it in a value that is likely to go up over time.
Okay, fascinating. Any other questions or points anyone from the audience wants to raise? There's one at the back here. Yeah.
Hi there, thank you very much for your respective inputs. If I may, and focus on the nexus between crime and terrorism, or the manner in which I would view it is the terrorist appropriation of criminal activities to further their aims. I wonder if we should actually be focusing on the enablers to both crime and terrorism. And to that, I'm thinking about, and you've discussed it between you, those individuals involved are limited only by their imagination. So how they raise their funds will be from Nike trainers, from oil, and everything in between. So if you tackle the enablers of transport, of finance, cyber as an enabler to that activity, and turn them into inhibitors, you will impact on both the crime and terror nexus. But my question to you, and following that theme, is how much do you see corruption as an enabler to both crime and terrorism?
Peter?
I always get the difficult question.
Yeah, we're picking on you today.
So is corruption helping terrorism? Absolutely, right? Would be the eradication of corruption go a long way to help the problem? Yes. Is the eradication of corruption going to be the end of terrorism? No, because it simply is an enabler. So yes, there is a connection there, but I do fully agree with that you need to target the facilitators, and that's what my part of the Security Council that I'm advising is doing at the moment. I mean, there is the global sanctions list against ISIL and Al-Qaida that has about 275 plus individuals at the moment on the list, and the focus at the moment is distinctly on the financial facilitators of whatever kind, be it arms smugglers or antiquity smugglers or oil smugglers or money service providers that they deal in a systematic way to transfer that money, to put them on a global sanctions list, because those facilitators are supremely vulnerable to publicity. So it's not about what member states do to implement the sanctions, it's simply the fact that the name is on a globally available public sanctions list of the Security Council that says ISIL and Al-Qaeda sanctions list. That will really greatly reduce their ability to act as financial enablers, because as they're going between the terrorist groups and the illicit economy, they do need an address, they do need a company potentially to launder money, and they do definitely need a bank account at one point or the other. And all of these three things are much harder when your name is connected with ISIL in a public manner. So there is an instrument, globally speaking, that can be used in a far more frequent way than it's been done so far. But we were trying to target exactly those individuals.
Obviously, you wanted to add something to that, didn't you?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question about the enablers. In the tobacco industry, there are quite a few enablers. If you just look at the trade and the distribution, just give you two examples, which happened quite recently. UPS, a big multinational company, has been fined $247 million in the United States for shipping cigarettes from one country to another, or the United States, one nation to another. Of course, the company was not aware of what they were transporting, but their defense was that they were taking parcels with 2 or 3 bundles, so small quantities, and they were not legally in charge of having to check what was inside the parcels. And they got, after a long process, they got a fine $247 million. And I think that's clearly showing that a company like UPS can do more to control their supply chain and what they're transporting. They're going to appeal it, but I think it's a sign that these logistic companies can play a role, just like the credit card companies. Or another example is the shipping lines. There are quite a few shipping lines, but there's quite a concentration in the freight transportation. And this company signed in November of this year in Brussels a letter of understanding, so an intention of, together with many producers of fast-moving consumer goods like Philip Morris, but also P&G, Nestle, and so on, in order to do more to control what's in the containers. And I do think, and it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about the public-private partnership, I think multinational companies have a duty to do more to control their business, whatever business they're doing and whatever problems they can have. And I do think that using the typical carrot and stick can help multinational companies do the right thing.
I'm going to actually ask the last question, and it's something that's puzzling me. We've had everything from, let's say, nail bars right up to oil production for financing terror. And this is a question any of you want to feel. It's the last question. What is going to surprise us next? What area of human activity, and especially in the financial field, is going to end up funding the bad guys? And keep it brief, if you can. Is there anyone has any?
I'll go first. I more a personal opinion than a Mastercard one, but I think for me,
so keep it.
I think it's the rapid growth of technology, and certainly in industry, how some of the financial players struggle to keep up with that growth. And I think someone mentioned earlier fintechs as well. There's new players coming into the financial sector who've got no traditional retail banking or banking knowledge. They're just moving so fast with technology, and society, the younger generations, are driving that so rapidly. I think for me, that will be the thing that will surprise us most, is the way that technology will continue to evolve so rapidly. It will still continue to allow the system to be exploited, and I don't think we fully understand that yet.
Any other surprising areas?
Well, in my view, that what's going to surprise us, that we only saw the tip of the iceberg, is the cyber attacks. I think that's going to be something which is going to become much bigger in the future, and I think we're just not prepared for it. Everything is much more, you can control your house remotely with apps on your iPhone and so on, your heater, but the security on those apps and those services is very, very limited. And I think we're going to be finding ourselves in big trouble going forward.
There are even the rumours, apparently, I'm just hearing that British Airways might have been under attack today from cyber attack too. So that's food for thought, but disturbing all the same. But I don't know about you, I found this fascinating. It's opened up a whole new world, a dark market, if you like. And so I'd like to thank the panel and the audience for a fascinating discussion today on the nexus between crime and terrorism in this century. Thank you. Thank you. Just say finally a few kind of things. Refreshments are available outside, ladies and gentlemen, in the foyer. But I'm told to remind you to be back in your seats in half an hour, 15:30. That's 3:30 where I come from, for the next session on the fight against fake news. A struggle dear to our hearts, I'm sure. And at the same time, in the Danube space, I'm told, just outside the lobby, downstairs, the discussion at the GLOBSEC Future Forum will be on the future of defence. Thank you again very much for your attention and the good debate we've had here today. Thank you.